Are you feeling more fulfilled now that you're back to work?
This Friday,
No. I need a vacation.
see the movie that critics are saying is an awesome,
Look at that.
crowd-pleasing, fist-pumping, all-out brawl of a film.
You're right about that.
They're coming after our family. Go fix this.
Oh, my.
Nobody 2, rated R, only in theaters Friday.
When Jamal Khashoggi was killed in 2018, I was a new journalist. I'd just been hired to my first staff job at a daily news show over at New York Public Radio. Khashoggi was a Saudi dissident living in Turkey and working as a journalist for the Washington Post when he was brutally murdered and dismembered by agents of the Crown Prince.
This practice, this conduct, whether it's by Saudi Arabia or anyone else, is totally unacceptable.
What I remember from that time was the solidarity. Everyone seemed outraged, ready to rally around the cause. Politicians, human rights activists, and of course, journalists.
At the time of his death in Istanbul, he was a part of our community, and we feel his loss even today as a blow, a loss, a tragedy, and a horrible crime that has no justice.
The coverage of his death was sustained. For weeks, it came from every news channel, every newspaper.
Yeah, it felt that there was this laser-like focus. And of course, unfortunately, we didn't see justice. We haven't seen justice, and relations with Saudi Arabia have gone back to normal.
That's Jody Ginsburg. She's the head of the Committee to Protect Journalists, a nonprofit organization that promotes press freedom worldwide. And we scheduled this interview because another prominent journalist has been killed by state actors.
So on Sunday, an Al-Jazeera team that included the Al-Jazeera reporter Anas al-Sharif was killed by Israel in a targeted airstrike.
Anas al-Sharif and his entire team were reporting in Gaza, outside a hospital, in a tent clearly marked with the words press. He was described as the face of the war in Gaza for millions of news consumers.
He had 2 small children and a wife. He covered this story night and day for Al Jazeera. And most recently, of course, just before the journalist tent was hit, he was talking about the increased bombardment of Gaza City after Israel decided that it was going to escalate its incursions. He wanted to tell this story, the story of his people. Anas al-Sharif covered some of the biggest moments in the war, and of course, most recently, the starvation being experienced by Gazans.
Yeah, just a few weeks ago, he had this very notable report where he broke down while reporting on the starvation that you're talking about.
After nearly 2 years of reporting the war, you saw the strains of reporting on the deaths of your loved ones over and over again, and of the immense deprivations being experienced by everyone, including the reporters who are covering the effects of this war. Anas al-Sharif talked about his own hunger in that report and the starvation that so many Gazans were experiencing.
Israel denies that it's using starvation as a weapon of war. It's denying that there's any starvation in Gaza at all. But the photos and reporting that came from Anas al-Sharif and his colleagues tell a different story, one that's impossible to turn away from. And it's making me feel like I did back when Jamal Khashoggi was killed.
I do think it's breaking through in ways that others haven't, and I'll tell you why. I think it's because the attack was so brazen. International humanitarian law is very clear on this point. Journalists are civilians. They must never be deliberately targeted, and to do so is a war crime. And I think it's that has broken through it.
Today on the show, Journalists are marked for death in Gaza. Why their reporting still breaks through. I'm Rob Gunther, filling in for Mary Harris. You're listening to What Next? Stick around.
Swamp Notes is a podcast about U.S. politics and the economy from the Financial Times, and we start each episode with a big question. Like, what do tariffs mean for Big Pharma, and who's winning under Donald Trump? Then we get you answers.
The big takeaway is just how much risk now emanates directly from the Oval Office.
Tackle the big questions about money, power, and American politics every weekend with Swamp Notes, wherever you get your podcasts.
Hi, it's Willa Paskin, the host of Decoder Ring, and we have a new episode for you all about an article of faith for many Americans.
It's shocking to me that there's this idea that all Britons have bad teeth. This is not a fringe opinion.
It certainly is not.
Why don't you get your teeth fixed?
I live in Britain. I don't want to stand out.
Well, British people have notoriously bad teeth, so...
But does this stereotype about British people have any validity? And if not, why do we think it does?
I was quite keen to sort of dispel that because it's a bit irritating, Americans always thinking their teeth are brilliant.
Might there be something equally strange about American teeth?
They look very, fake. Yeah. Whereas here, I've always had patients tell me, oh, don't make my dentures too white. They actually call it horse teeth.
Find out on Slate's Decoder Ring, wherever you listen to podcasts.
I want to start with this weekend's attack. Can you walk me through what we know about what happened?
So what we understand happened is that a group of journalists reporting from a tent housing journalists was hit in a direct and targeted attack by Israeli forces. You will know that everyone inside Gaza has been repeatedly displaced, including journalists. So many people are living and working in these incredibly precarious settings. This was a journalist tent next to a hospital in Gaza City, and the Israeli army launched a direct strike on the tent, and it contained 4 Al-Jazeera staff, so that's correspondents Anas al-Sharif and Mohammed Kritka, camera operators Ibrahim Zaher and Mohammed Nufal, and 2 freelancers, Moamen Aliwa and Mohammed Al-Khalidi. So that's 6 journalists killed in this targeted strike. Israel has admitted to the strike, and it says it was targeting Anas al-Sharif, whom it claims was an active Hamas operative.
I think it's important to talk about his reporting that's come out in the last month or so. These images of graphic starvation, starving civilians, women, children. It really does seem to have brought a renewed attention to the conflict.
In recent weeks, what we saw was Anas al-Sharif was one of the journalists really bringing attention to the desperate plight of Gazans, the absolute starvation being experienced by Gazans because of this deliberate refusal by Israel to allow sufficient food aid in. He cried on air. After that report, he was accused by a spokesperson for the Israeli military of crying crocodile tears. So Anas al-Sharif was one of the people drawing attention. Again, it broke through what has been a kind of apathy about Gaza. After those reports, that's when we started to see, again, this rehearsal that we'd seen in the previous year of these allegations that Anas al-Sharif was a member of Hamas. And I don't think that's coincidental.
You've said the Israeli military has said he was deliberately targeted. They've also said that they can show unequivocal proof of his ties to Hamas. You're saying that's not the full story. Tell me what's going on.
So Israel has alleged for some time that Anas al-Sharif is an active Hamas militant. They've produced documentation, which they published on X, formerly Twitter, that they say shows that he was in the pay of Hamas. Those documents precede 2023, so they say nothing about whether or not he's continually to be actively involved. Other reports, not from Israel, not from Israeli authorities, have shown that he was employed by Hamas in Hamas's media section prior to 2023. But the evidence that Israel has produced so far do not demonstrate or do not corroborate its claims that he was an active commander in this war. And the evidence that it's produced so far, many experts have cast doubt on. And of course, we can't corroborate those. We don't have access to the originals. We're not allowed to see that information. We're not being given that information.
Can you talk about al-Sharif's previous posts on social media that seem to show a connection to Hamas? And what does that say in light of the Israeli military's accusations?
Social media posts have circulated that show that he has voiced support for Hamas, that he's voiced support for the October 7th killings of Israelis by Hamas. In recent weeks, there have also been posts, I understand, from Anas al-Sharif that were critical of Hamas. But it's important to state, and I want to be very clear, that international humanitarian law is very clear on this point. Journalists are considered civilians under international humanitarian law and afforded the protection of civilians, which means they must never be deliberately targeted. They lose that protection if they take direct part in the hostilities. Now, we need to understand clearly what direct participation means. Direct participation means acts of war that are likely to cause actual harm to personnel and equipment of enemy forces. And propaganda, if you consider his social media posts to have been propaganda, for example, from Hamas, propaganda or expressing sympathy can't be considered direct participation.
How has the international community reacted to this killing?
This is a reaction that we haven't seen before. So, without a doubt, this is the deadliest conflict for journalists that the Committee to Protect Journalists has ever covered. 192 journalists killed since the start of the war, 184 of them Palestinians killed by Israel. And yet, certainly in the first months of the war, we saw very little international support for journalists, including from the journalist community. That has started to shift, but certainly this story seems to have broken through like no other. And I think that's in part because it was not just Anas al-Sharif who was killed in this attack. And that even if you accept the Israeli claims that he was a terrorist, that does not explain the killing of 5 other journalists in the same attack. Israel has made no effort to explain why it was acceptable to kill those journalists alongside Anas al-Sharif. Anas al-Sharif is very well known. There have been many opportunities where if it wanted, it could have taken out Anas al-Sharif. It did so and took out the entire Al-Jazeera news crew for Gaza City. That is a war crime.
My understanding about journalists in Gaza in particular are very deliberate about identifying themselves as press. They wear helmets, they say press, flak jackets, they say press. I guess my question is it safe for journalists in Gaza to continue to identify themselves? Do you think this helped the Israeli military target this group?
The Israeli military is very sophisticated. So to be honest, I don't think it matters whether they say press or wear their helmets. Certainly that's offered them no protection thus far. It doesn't matter whether they mark their cars as press. Israel knows where those individuals are. It is monitoring people's cell phones. Anas al-Sharif, right at the beginning of the war, received calls from the Israeli military warning him to stop reporting. Several weeks later, there was an attack on the building, his family home, that killed his 90-year-old father. To be honest, I don't think, it certainly doesn't offer any protection. It's not clear that that's drawing attention to them in a way that Israel is unaware of. It knows exactly who the journalists are and who's doing the reporting.
After the break, how this attack is the latest in a deadly pattern and who should be called on to stop it. Jody, I want to dig into this relationship between Israel and Al-Jazeera, and I want to do that by going back to May 2022. A Palestinian journalist, Shireen Abu Aklay, also from Al-Jazeera, was shot and killed by the Israeli military while covering the West Bank. Can you tell us what happened?
Much like Anas al-Sharif has become a very well-known, almost household name in the region since the start of the war, Shireen Abu Aklay, she was really, really well-known in the region. She'd been covering West Bank, Gaza for decades, and she was covering the aftermath of what appeared to be some shooting from a distance, again, wearing her press vest, helmet, and she was shot in the neck and killed. Abu Aklay is a Palestinian-American dual citizen. And initially, Israel tried to claim that, tried to suggest that they hadn't been responsible. When it became very clear that it was Israeli fire, they tried to say that there was some kind of shooting going on nearby. That was not the case. And they would have known, and all of the studies show, and there have been several independent studies, that she was a journalist. She was clearly marked as a journalist, and she was shot and killed anyway. There has been no accountability in that case at all, and that's a pattern that we have seen again and again. In 2023, around a year after Shireen's killing, CPJ produced a report called Deadly Pattern, in which we found that 20 journalists had been killed by Israeli forces over the preceding 22 years, and in not a single case had there been any kind of accountability for those deaths.
There's this documentary that came out this May from Zeteo. It's called Who Killed Shireen? The executive producer of that documentary did an interview with NPR, and they cited CPJ. They say that, quote, her killing was in some ways the beginning of a trajectory for the Israeli military. Before Shireen, Israel was never on the list of the most dangerous countries for journalists, and now, according to Committee to Protect Journalists, Israel is considered the most dangerous country for journalists because of what's happened in Gaza. How do you explain that trajectory?
Impunity. It's a word that gets used a lot, unfortunately, in the work that I do at the Committee to Protect Journalists. If no one is held responsible for a journalist's killing, what you do is you create an environment in which killing journalists is acceptable. And I think Shireen's case embodied that, right? That here was a case that's very clear-cut. She was unlawfully killed by the Israeli military. All of the studies show that. And yet nobody has ever been held accountable. There was an investigation, as the Zeteo documentary shows, but nothing was done about that. There was no follow-up from the US. Shireen Abu Aklay was an American citizen, and this is part of the impunity question. It's not just Israel's failure to investigate. That might be expected. If Israel is responsible, it doesn't necessarily want to air its own dirty laundry, but you would expect the international community to do more. Certainly the countries that have dual citizens, like America for Shireen, and yet there was very little energy put into properly investigating and holding Israel accountable for her killing.
I really want to laser in on the role of the U.S. in particular, because Zeteo's reporting relies on this unnamed former Biden official who says that the U.S. went to the site of Shireen's killing and concluded that it was intentional. But that official went home and says that the Biden administration overruled this finding. NPR also talked to this official who came away with that same reporting from the unnamed official. How big of a role would you ascribe to the Biden administration in allowing this deadly climate to take root in Israel and Palestine?
The US talks proudly in international communities about its belief in press freedom. It wears the First Amendment as a kind of badge of honor. It talks about press freedom as one of the kind of key underpinnings of American democracy. And yet successive administrations, including the Biden administration, have failed to ensure that that is upheld equally. You compare, say, the reaction of the US administration to Shireen's killing to the arrest of Evan Gershkovich, the Wall Street Journal reporter who was wrongfully detained by Russia. the US government was extremely active in that. Biden took a personal interest in that case. You remember the images of Biden hugging the families when the prisoner exchange that the US helped broker was completed. We saw none of that kind of effort on Shireen's case. And we see none of that effort ensuring that Israel upholds its commitments to protect journalists and press freedom writ large. We've raised the unprecedented level of killing over and over again with the US administration. And what we heard repeatedly was sort of warm words talking about how important press freedom is. And, yes, we've raised it with Netanyahu, and yes, we've talked about it in a press conference, but nothing beyond that.
As part of Israel's recently announced offensive to take control of Gaza City, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu also said he wants to bring in foreign journalists. How does that square with everything that we've been talking about?
I really struggle to believe that Israel is going to allow in foreign correspondents. As I've said, it is unprecedented. It is that foreign journalists should be entirely shut out for this length of time. And even as recently as a few weeks ago, Israel was actively preventing journalists from sharing footage of Gaza. So you may remember this. The BBC's Jeremy Bowen, the Middle East reporter who's covered countless numbers of wars, went up with one of the Israeli airdrops. And they were allowed to film the airdrop, but they were not allowed to film or share the footage of what they saw out of the floor of that plane, which was a territory that had been utterly flattened. He had to describe it, but he wasn't allowed to share that footage. That was a couple of weeks ago. So the likelihood of Israel saying, yes, go forth, go wherever you like, go freely, share whatever footage, talk to whomever you like, to me, it seems incredible. I really struggle to see why, after nearly 2 years, they would completely shift.
As we talk about this culture of impunity, I'm wondering if you are seeing it start to bleed out into other countries, in particular the US. And I'm thinking of a few examples. One of them recently, earlier in the summer, when federal troops moved to quell protests in Los Angeles, there was this viral moment where an Australian journalist seemed to have been targeted point blank by an officer with some sort of a stun gun. Is there danger that this is going to become a pattern in other countries as well?
I don't know if you can draw a direct line between the impunity we see in Israel specifically and the broader world. What I do know, and what all of the evidence over the last 30 plus years points to, is that we are seeing more and more attacks in more and more places, including places that are supposedly democracies, on journalists. And that starts often at the top, with smears against journalists. We heard Trump in his first term talk about journalists as enemies of the people. We've seen that kind of language repeated by leaders in Brazil, in Hungary, across the world, that language. And that creates this environment in which people see journalists as the enemy. They see them as corrupt. They see them as untrustworthy. And that's a deliberate narrative, because if you want to control the narrative as an autocrat, as someone who wants to have only their narrative pushed, you want to sow doubt amongst anyone who is reporting differently, reporting accurately, reporting critically. And that has a knock-on effect in that you start to see increased online attacks on journalists, hate mail, particularly female journalists and journalists from marginalized communities. I have colleagues who receive death threats on a daily basis for reporting on White House politics, on politics from Westminster in the UK. And then that, unfortunately, can then lead further to physical attacks on journalists, the sense that it's okay to go after a journalist physically, to harm them physically. And we've seen that here in the United States. Journalists have had bricks thrown through their window, graffiti sprayed on their walls. They've felt so intimidated by online harassment that some have had to move. Because remember, Journalists don't just work for big news outlets. Most journalists are local journalists who will be well known in their local communities. And if you are the person exposing the wrongdoing of a local police chief or a local governor, your local education authority, you are highly vulnerable because people know where you live. And that is a trend that we have certainly seen over the past 30 years, and it has accelerated and worsened to a really alarming extent in the last 5 years or so.
I want to circle back to Gaza. What are you hearing from the remaining journalists still reporting this war day in and day out?
One of the things that the Committee to Protect Journalists does is we provide direct assistance where we can to journalists. And that includes where we are able to supporting journalists who need to flee because they are being targeted. We've done that for decades across the world. We are not able to evacuate journalists from Gaza at present because that relies on the goodwill of a number of different governments, and it's extraordinarily hard to get anyone out of Gaza unless they are in life-threatening condition, and even then that's very difficult. But we have seen a huge uptick in the past week of journalists reaching out to us, desperately wanting to get to safety, who are fearful for their lives, who are starving to death, who are injured, sick, and who want to get to a place of safety. We are also hearing more and more from journalists concerned that they are now the next targets. They are seeing smears against them from a variety of different sources and worry that those narratives that those journalists are untrustworthy, that they're Hamas operatives, that they're terrorists, will be used as an excuse for them to be targeted next. And that is something that has rapidly escalated in the past 2 days.
Jodi Ginsburg, thank you. I'm very grateful for your time.
Thank you so much.
Jodi Ginsburg is the head of the Committee to Protect Journalists, a nonprofit dedicated to advancing the cause of press freedom worldwide. And that's the show. What Next is produced by Paige Osburn, Elena Schwartz, Anna Phillips, Madeline Ducharme, and Ethan Oberman. Ben Richmond is the Senior Director of Podcast Operations here at Slate, and I'm Rob Gunther. You can find me on Blue Sky. I'm at OneRobGunther. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you soon.